Health Secretary Wes Streeting has announced a total ban on the use of puberty blockers by people under the age of 18. The ban comes after NHS prescriptions for puberty blockers were halted in March, and it follows a temporary ban put in place in May by the last government. Now, that ban stopped children with gender dysphoria in the UK from buying puberty blockers from European or private prescribers. It's that ban which has now been extended indefinitely. Laying out his reasoning in Parliament, Wes Streeting said this.
In the past few months, I have met with young trans people who have been, may be, or will be affected by the decisions I and my predecessor have taken. I've listened to their concerns, their fears, and their anxieties, and I want to talk to them directly now. I know it's not easy being a trans kid in our country today. The trans community is at the wrong end of all of the statistics for mental ill health, self-harm, and suicide. I can't pretend to know what that's like, but I do know what it's like to feel you have to bury a secret about yourself, to be afraid of who you are, to be bullied for it, and then to experience the liberating experience of coming out. I know it won't feel like it based on the decisions I'm taking today, but I really do care about this, and so does this government. I'm determined to improve the quality of care and access to healthcare for all trans people. I'm convinced that the full implementation of the CAS review will deliver material improvements in the well-being, safety, and dignity of trans people of all ages. And this government will work with them to help them live freely, equally, and with the dignity that everyone in our country deserves.
So as Wes Streeting referred to there, this ban follows the recommendations of the CAS report. That was a government commissioned study that found there was insufficient evidence about the long-term outcomes for children and teenagers prescribed puberty blockers. She didn't actually advise a ban in that report, but she has spoken now positively about this move by Wes Streeting today. That's Hilary Cass, who wrote the report. The advice, or this decision actually, from Wes Streeting also follows newer advice from the Commission on Human Medicines, which found, quote, an unacceptable safety risk in the continued prescription of puberty blockers to children, unquote. According to the Commission, some children were prescribed the medication after filling out an online questionnaire and participating in just one Zoom call. The ban will be reviewed in 2027, and any breach of it will be a criminal offence, though it won't impact young people who are already taking puberty blockers. Those people will be able to continue to get the medicine from a UK registered prescriber so long as they already have a valid prescription. Streeting also pledged that the government would set up a clinical trial into the use of puberty blockers next year with the aim of establishing a clear evidence base for the use of the drugs. And he pledged that NHS England would set up new gender identity services for young people following the closure of London's Tavistock Centre. Now, as you can imagine, there's been a lot of reaction to the ban in Parliament. Labour's Rachel Taylor gave an account of how the lack of gender identity services had impacted a child in her constituency.
He was referred by his GP when he was in year 8 for gender dysphoria. He has still not been seen by a specialist, and he's now in his first year doing his A-levels. He's had to endure going through periods, suffering at school with the embarrassment of that. He decided to stop eating and was then diagnosed with anorexia because that was the only way that he felt that he could stop his periods and stop his breasts growing. These are the kinds of things that trans young people go through day in, day out. 3.5 years later, it's not good enough that he has still not been seen by a medical professional. And he is in the West Midlands, one of the areas where we're not yet announcing specialist services are going to be extended.
So that was a statement sort of about healthcare for young trans people. I'm not sure if there was sort of a particular point there made about puberty blockers, which is, what was being announced there. Although actually Wes Streeting would say that he was also announcing these new services. After Streeting's statement, Green Party Deputy Leader Zach Polansky said this: Wes Streeting's decision to ban puberty blockers should be called out for what it is. He's playing culture wars where trans and non-binary youth are collateral damage and Labour dance to reform's tune. An attack on trans people is an attack on our LGBTQ plus community. We must say no. Others were more celebratory, with now independent but former Labour MP Rosie Duffield saying this: love and gratitude to every person who has spoken up against the scandal of puberty blockers over the last few years. To all of us cancelled, blanked, ignored, or gaslit. Hannah's B, I think that's Hannah Barnes, who wrote a book about this sort of issue. She says, "You Shiro," and thank you, Wes Streeting. Helena, obviously very, a very emotional topic. Wes Streeting in Parliament trying to say, I've made this decision, but I stand with trans people. Do you think that's consistent?
It's a difficult one. It's really difficult to comment on. The thing is, as well, is it's not a ban on puberty blockers. It's a ban on puberty blockers specifically for treating gender dysphoria, specifically for trans people. It's not for people who have precocious puberty. They will still be able to access these things just fine. Now, it's obviously better if they're going to do a clinical trial to then be able to find out whether or not there is a reason for keeping them legal or not, or keeping them unbanned or not. But that's not going to help all the people if at the end of that trial they find out that there's no reason to have them banned, who've had to go through a puberty that they don't want throughout the entirety of that time period. I think you'd struggle to find any trans person. For someone myself, I started transitioning at the age of, or medically transitioning at the age of 28. If I'd have had access to these things a lot younger, I'd have a much higher quality of life now. But that's looking in retrospect. Whereas when you actually look at the problems people are now facing, people really do need these things. People have real tangible stories of trauma that they have to go through from experiencing the wrong puberty. And that's happening immediately right now. Lots of these people don't have time to wait. And even then, a trial that they might do has already been called out by the Council of Europe as potentially being unethical. Because if you're doing a double-blind trial and the people who are on the blind end who are receiving the placebo, they're going to already know that they're not going to actually getting access to these medication in reality, because they're going to start going through puberty anyway, and they're going to have to deal with the consequences of being unlucky to be put in the control group there, and that could have serious ethical ramifications. And the big problem of all this is that I feel like it's a slippery slope for much further. He says wants to implement the recommendations of the CAS review. And as you said in your piece there, this was not recommended by the CAS review. In fact, if you go into the CAS review, if you find Appendix 8 in the CAS review, they show that they actually reviewed, hundreds of different records and different pieces of information of trans kids who had to use puberty blockers, and in literally 0 cases was that treatment removed due to professional advice or due to side effects, right? 0, absolutely no cases within the CAS's own information that was provided in the review. And Hilary Cass herself at the time even said there is an undue disproportionate focus on puberty blockers as an issue. And I think that there's a reason for this. I think there's a reason why we have a disproportionate focus on puberty blockers as a very specific part of the debate about trans people. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you a quote from a statement made by a speaker at GenSpec's conference in Lisbon, GenSpec being kind of gender critical pressure group. Well, we certainly want to stop gender medicine and protect women's sports, but that's not enough. And that's when the thing that has caused so much trouble as this idea is spread, namely that everything is connected and they can start to work with this. Sports means changing rooms as well as competitions. It means the development pipeline as well as elite competitions. That means sport in schools. If you can't lie about who's a boy and a girl who's playing sport, how can you lie elsewhere in school? No gender child medicine means an end to the idea of the trans child. It means no longer teaching children transitioning is a thing. It means you can't pretend boys are girls and girls are boys. And once you stop that pretense, it's obvious the world's boy and girl in school mean rules and safeguarding. If you can't let boys go into girls' space in school without endangering kids, you can't keep them out without being clear who is actually a boy and who is actually a girl. Then you can make the same argument for adults. First in spaces where there's someone who knows everyone knows duty of care, for example, prisons or workplaces, and then other spaces too. Because if men can't use women's toilets at work, then why on earth will let them do so in the shopping centre? This is the real importance of the UK's ban on puberty blockers. There is not really a serious treatment option in the UK, and I don't think more than hundreds of kids have taken them, certainly not more than a few thousand. What they are is a rhetorical and argumentative device. And that's the thing. That's what I believe the focus on the puberty blockers is. It's a specific Trojan horse to be able to try and get people to accept one removal of the rights of trans people as a rhetorical engine to be able to justify all of the rest of them. Well, if we can't allow kids to go through this kind of gender-affirming care, well, then they can't go through further when they become age of 18. We can start rolling back other trans people's care as well. We can start talking about rolling back other things like societal transition for young people too. I think that this is a rhetorical device that's being used to create a slippery slope for further things. things. And so when Streeting says things like, well, trans kids are being unheard, trans people unheard, well, he did meet a big group of trans people. There's a great post from India Willoughby talking about somebody who was in this meeting about the emotionally charged atmosphere in the room at the time, speaking to West Streeting, all of the emotional pleas to not ban what they believe themselves to be incredibly important medicines for themselves as trans kids. And apparently he recognized the emotional nature of people's pleas to him to not ban it, and then he went ahead and did it anyway. Yet when it comes to a group of Christian nurses, or a group of nurses, backed by Christian Legal, who were complaining about having to share changing rooms with trans people, they got their own special meeting, and it's looking like there's already been intimations towards alleged or changes into NHS operational procedure that would disadvantage trans people specifically. So, do I have the best of thoughts? Am I hopeful about Wes Streeting's position as in the Department of Health and Social Care to treat trans people with dignity and with respect? No, I don't have any trust in him at all.
I mean, I totally take your point that this is the kind of thing that will be used by people who are just in general opposed to trans rights. I suppose where I'm sort of reluctant to completely dismiss where Wes Streeting is coming from is he has been advised, by a couple of sort of medical bodies or reports. Obviously, there are medical bodies in different countries who completely disagree. So it seems to me like there is genuine debate here, and some of it is not necessarily being had for ulterior motives. It's that there's genuine medical disagreement. And I suppose for me, why it seems like there's almost something irresolvable with puberty blockers is because it seems sort of from the literature that many people who suffer gender dysphoria when they're children will always want to be trans, and other people who suffer gender dysphoria when they're children, it might resolve without them becoming trans. And one of the things that, where people can sort of work out if this is a temporary or a permanent thing is puberty. So I think it said in the Cass review that there are studies which show that one of the things which does resolve or which can resolve gender dysphoria in young people is puberty, which then sort of makes them feel more aligned with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Now, and why I think this is impossible is because obviously the people for whom the gender dysphoria is not temporary, they would be much better having puberty blockers, right? So obviously if you are going to be trans your whole life, it's much better to start transitioning before puberty than afterwards. But if you give people puberty blockers, then you're not going to know if they would be the kids with gender dysphoria for whom it might be resolved without transitioning. Do you see where I'm coming from? So it seems to me that there is a genuine sort of issue which is very difficult to resolve as sort of someone doing a well-meaning study into what is the best medical care for people. A separate question about whether a ban is sensible. I think you probably should leave it to the medical profession. But I suppose, what do you think of the idea that there is, lots of the people who are working on this, making decisions about this, might be motivated by just this being quite a new, complex medical issue, not necessarily using this as kind of a battering ram to try and roll back trans rights more generally?
I think that you could probably find plenty of people who are only taking in what they believe to be an evidence-based approach, right? Who are only looking in what they believe is a dispassionate and objective viewpoint. But as you've already said there are plenty of people who are medical professionals who don't have a skin in the game who've come to different conclusions, very, very wildly different or maybe slightly different conclusions on this issue. And I think around the issues that you raised there, the difficulty comes in, well, how can you trust politicians, especially politicians like Wes Streeting, who, from what I've seen, have very clear biases on this issue, going on to Julia Hartley-Brewer's show on Talk TV and instantly dismissing the existence of trans people, or going on to Harry Cole in The Sun and saying, well, if you'd asked me before, I'd said that trans people are the gender they say they are, but now I'm going to have a different opinion. Can you trust a politician specifically to take into account the plurality of voices in the room and come to an evidence-based opinion on that? Or can you only rely on them to pick and choose the kind of information that they want to be able to implement into policy? This is the problem that we have with things like think tanks, for example, in that they're not there to have a dispassionate, evidence, objective-based view in totality of the evidence. They're there to push a specific political angle, and they are used by politicians to be able to have evidentiary support for the policies they wanted to implement anyway. So whether or not the actual scientists and the statisticians and the people who are doing these studies themselves are doing these things in earnest or sincerely, they probably are. But I don't think you can trust politicians, let alone Wes Streeting, to give you the totality of the evidence to come to the correct political decision.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think where I stand on this is I think there is a genuine question. I'm concerned, I think, when I see people say anyone sort of interested in this or caring about this or thinks that there is a genuine sort of challenge, to be resolved, must have ulterior motives. I think that's problematic. At the same time, I think probably it shouldn't be in the hands of politicians, and a ban does seem over the top. Why not leave it to medical practitioners and have some strong guidelines or whatever?
Let parents and the kids themselves be able to make their own personal judgment as to whether this is something that they want to do. As far as I'm concerned, I agree with Tim Waltz on this issue. What is between a doctor and a patient themselves should be up to them. It should be between them. It should be confidential. It should be entirely their decision. And the government getting involved is state overreach, in my mind.